Hello traders, Rich here, and starting today I'll be posting daily updates for Bitcoin in under 1 minute. So let's do it. As we clearly see, Bitcoin is trading inside this giant channel in blue. Inside it, we also got this channel in red. And as per my last analysis, we know that Bitcoin is approaching a very strong area, which is the intersection of the 20k support, which is visible from weekly time frame, and this lower trend line acting as an on-horizontal support. That's why we'll be looking for buy stops. We don't buy blindly because Bitcoin can still break this 20k support downward. In this case, a movement till the lower bound of this big channel would be expected, where we'll be looking for buy setups. But let's take it step by step, right? Approaching this support area, that's why we'll be looking for buy setups. If we zoom into M30 time frame, you know that Bitcoin is forming an inverse head and shoulders pattern, and while waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above this area with a momentum candle close. Meanwhile, Bitcoin can still trade lower, dive inside the support zone. In this case, we'll be also looking for buy setups. Of course, unless it's broken downward, then a movement low would be expected. That is for day one, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, and welcome back to Bitcoin in a minute, day 2. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 20k support, so we are looking for buy stops unless the support is broken downward, then a movement to the lower bound or lower trend line and the 12k demand zone would be expected. But for now, let's take it step by step. Around the support, we are still looking for buy stops. If you zoom into M20 time frame, yesterday we had an inverse head and shoulders pattern forming, but price kept trading lower, so it's no longer valid. Let's update our analysis. For now, we've got a double bottom forming, and this is still our same neckline. My alert is still here, so I'm waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above it for the correction movement to start till around the upper bound, which we saw from daily time frame. And of course, we've got this zone here that the bulls need to break from a short-term perspective to be able to trade higher, but I'm keeping an eye on this zone here to expect this bullish movement. Meanwhile, until this happens, Bitcoin can still trade lower and lower. In this case, we'll keep looking for buy stops here unless we break it downward. That's it for day 2, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, and welcome to Bitcoin in a minute, day 3. As per my last analysis, we are still sitting around the 20k support, and we are still waiting for the bulls to take over for the correction to start till around the upper bound of the brown channel. Meanwhile, of course, the bears can still kick in and break below this support for it to become a resistance, and a movement to the next demand zone would be expected, which would be around 12k. That's why we zoom into lower time frames to wait for the bulls to take over. As per my yesterday analysis, we were waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above this from a short-term perspective, and this one finally above the double bottom neckline, which obviously didn't happen. So let's delete the analysis previously that we had because clearly the bulls didn't take over. Instead, we kept trading lower and lower as per this analysis. So now we are currently trading inside a channel, and we can clearly see it here by connecting these highs, and this is our lowest bound. So while waiting for this, for example, and then a break above it, it would mean that the buyers are finally strong enough to break above it. In this case, a correction would be about to start. Of course, meanwhile, we can still trade lower and lower and even break this zone downward, or we can trade lower before the buyers take over. Let's see how it goes. That's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, and welcome to Bitcoin in a minute, day 4. As per yesterday analysis, we know that Bitcoin is still sitting around the 18k, 20k support, so we are still speculating a bullish correction from here. Of course, we need extra confirmation from lower time frames that the bulls are taking over. Meanwhile, the bears can still kick in, and if they want to break below this support, we need a momentum and aggressive bearish candle close below it. In this case, it would become a resistance and a movement to the next rejection, which is a demand zone 10, 12k from daily time frame would be expected. For now, let's take it step by step. Around the support, let's zoom into lower time frames and wait for extra confirmation for the buyers to take over. If we zoom into M30, yesterday we were waiting for a break above this channel. I don't really have much updates. Price is still stuck inside this range here, so let's update it real quick. I'm waiting for this, for a break above this high. And of course, we need a third swing from around the upper trend line for the buyers to take over. Meanwhile, we can still trade like this for a bit before breaking above this area, which, as you can see, my alert is here, or even break this one downward from a daily candle close below it. In this case, the support would be broken. That is for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, and welcome to Bitcoin in a minute, day 5. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 20k support, so we are still speculating this bullish correction from here. Of course, unless we have an aggressive daily candle close below this area, 18k, then a movement to the lower support be expected or demand zone around 10k, 12k. But for now, let's take it step by step, right? Around the support area and lower brown trend line. So we are still looking for buy stops. Of course, we need extra confirmation from lower time frames. If we zoom into H1 time frame, you can see that we've got a giant inverse head and shoulders pattern forming after this bearish impulse. We've got our left shoulder, head, and the right shoulder might be formed. In this case, this is our neckline in blue. Meanwhile, as mentioned yesterday, from M30 time frame, we've got this channel in red, and we are waiting for this swing break upward for the bulls to take over from a short-term perspective. Of course, we'll need this break also from a medium-term perspective. Meanwhile, until the bulls take over by breaking above this and then this, we can still trade lower and lower before breaking above the previous high or even break this support downward. In this case, a further movement down would be expected. That is for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, Day 6. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the support area 1820k, so we are still speculating this bullish correction. From here, of course, we need extra confirmation from lower time frames by breaking above the previous high. Meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and for them to push lower, we need to see a momentum candle close below the 18k. In this case, it would become a resistance and a movement to the lower bound, lower blue trend line, and 12k demand zone would be expected. For now, let's take it step by step around the support, looking for the buyers to take over. As mentioned yesterday, we are still below this blue area, which is our major swing high. And as mentioned yesterday, we also got and big inverse head and shoulders pattern. So here's our head, left and right shoulder. Of course, it's still forming from a shorter term perspective from N30. We've got a short term inverse head and shoulders as well. But of course, for the buyers to take over, we need to see a break above this from a short term perspective and then above this high from a medium term perspective. Meanwhile, before we break this and this high, we are still bearish and we can still trade lower and lower before trading higher or even break the support downward for it to become a resistance and so on. That's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, Day 7. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 18k, 20k support, so I'm speculating this bullish correction from here to around the upper bound of this brown channel. Meanwhile, if we see an aggressive candle close below this area, below 18k, then a movement low would be expected till the next rejection around 10 to 12k, which is a demand zone from weekly time frame and the lower trend line in blue, acting as a non-horizontal support or oversold area. Of course, for now, let's take it step by step around the support, waiting for the bulls to take over to start the correction movement. If you remember yesterday on M30, we had this channel, now it's broken, so it's no longer valid, so let's delete it. And we can see that we had an inverse head and shoulders, and as mentioned, we need a break above it and above this one in blue for the bulls to take over from a medium-term perspective to start the correction phase. Meanwhile, the bulls broke it slightly and then reversed, now forming a head and shoulders pattern, right? So here's our head, left and right shoulder. For the bears to take over, we need to see a break below the neckline. In this case, a short-term movement low would be expected, and of course it would be extended for a long-term bearish movement if we see a daily candle close, an aggressive one, below this area. In this case, a movement low would be expected, as I showed you from daily time frame. For now, we are still waiting for this break for the bears to take over and trade lower, and maybe then we will have a double bottom or a break above this area. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, Day 8. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 20k support, so I'm waiting for the bulls to take over for the bullish correction movement to start. Meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and if we have a break below this zone, from daily time frame, of course, after a big bearish momentum candle, then a movement low would be expected to the lower bound of this blue channel around 10 to 12k, which is also a strong demand zone from a weekly time frame. If we zoom into H1, we are still speculating this inverse head and shoulders pattern. It's a big reversal pattern after this bearish movement. For the bulls to take over, we need to see a break above the neckline, which is covering the entire structure, the entire range. Meanwhile, the bears, as mentioned, can still kick in, form a short-term movement before breaking above, for example, a double bottom neckline, which would become this instead of this. Of course, unless we keep on trading lower and you know the rest of the story, right? If you zoom into M30, we've got a head and shoulders. So a head and shoulders inside a head and shoulders, right? So it's an inverse one from H1, a classic one from M30. If we break below it, then a movement low would be expected, as I showed you from H1 till this area, unless it's also broken downwards. That's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, Day 9. If you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. So let's do it. As per yesterday's analysis, we know that Bitcoin is still sitting around the 18k, 20k support. So now we are stuck inside a whole range, which we can see better from lower time frames, and we are still waiting for the bulls to take over for the correction movement upward to start till around the upper brown trend line. Meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and if we have an aggressive candle close below the 18k, then a movement low would be expected till around the 10 to 12k, which is also a demand zone from lower time frames. If we zoom into H1 time frame, we have a giant head and shoulders pattern, which is like an entire range, and we are waiting for a break above the neckline, which is covering the entire structure. So then the bulls would take over, as mentioned yesterday. So I don't really have much updates for today, and this is also the view from M30. We are still stuck inside this range, so this is from a short-term perspective. If we have this break downward, then a movement low would be expected till the lower bound, and we'll see how price action, we'll monitor price action around this area. Meanwhile, from even a shorter term perspective, we have a channel here that if broken downward, then a movement to the neckline would be expected. So let's take it step by step and see how it goes. So from a short-term perspective, bears take over, bulls take over. From a medium-term perspective, bulls take over, bears take over, and so on. And of course, from a longer-term perspective, bears would be taking over by breaking below it, and the bulls around this area by breaking it upwards. That's it for today, and I will see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute Day 10. If you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 18k, 20k support, so we are speculating a bullish correction from here. Of course, we need the bulls to break above this minor high. Meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and if they manage to break below this 18k, then a movement low would be expected till the weekly demand around 10 to 12k. Let's take it step by step. Yeah, we are bearish from a long-term perspective inside the blue channel and from a short-term perspective inside the brown channel, but we are around the lower bound, a strong support. That's why we are speculating a bullish correction. If we zoom into H1, I don't really have much updates since yesterday. We are still waiting for this break for the bulls to take over from a short-term perspective and then medium-term perspective above the neckline, which is covering the entire structure. Meanwhile, the bears can still kick in for another bearish movement. We might see a double bottom before we break below above this neckline, or if the bears would break below the 18k as mentioned from daily time frame, then we'll be expecting another deep impulse movement downwards. If you zoom into M30 time frame, we had this head and shoulders pattern. We were waiting for the bears to take over if they would take over by breaking below it, which didn't happen. Instead, we kept trading higher. So now for the bears to take over from a short-term perspective, we need to see a break below this low, and then from a medium-term perspective below the neckline. In this case, a movement at the 18k again would be expected. And of course, this is the bullish scenario, short-term and medium-term. Best of luck, and I'll see you on the next one. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, Day 11. As usual, if you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still sitting around the 18k, 20k support, so we are speculating a bullish correction from here if the bulls take over by breaking above this minor high. Meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and if we break below the 18k with an aggressive daily candle close below it, then a movement lower to the 10, 12k demand zone would be expected. Now, if you zoom into H1 time frame, we can see that we are still trading inside this big inverse head and shoulders pattern. So for the bulls to take over, we need to see a break above its neckline in blue, which is covering the entire structure. From a short-term perspective, for the bulls to take over, we need to see a break above this high. And if you zoom into M30 time frame, as mentioned yesterday, for the bears to take over, we need to see a break below this trend line, which didn't happen yet. So let's delete it. And this is our last minor low. So the bears take over from a short-term perspective by breaking below it, and from a medium-term perspective by breaking below this area. In this case, a movement till the 18k again would be expected. Of course, from a short-term perspective, for the bulls to take over this break, and then finally this break to finally say that we are trading higher. Let's see how it goes. These are the possible scenarios. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 12. If you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As you can see, we are still struggling around the 18k, 20k support, so we are still waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above this minor high, or for the bears to take over by breaking below the 18k, in this case a movement lower to the lower band, lower blue trend line, and 12k would be expected. To know who will take over, we'll zoom into H1 time frame. As I showed you yesterday, we have this giant inverse head and shoulders pattern engulfing the entire shape, so we are waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above the neckline, or the bears can still take over. If we zoom into M30, we've got a head and shoulders inside the inverse head and shoulders. So as you can see, Bitcoin lately loves head and shoulders patterns. Here we have a head and shoulders pattern as well. Anyway, for the bears to take over from a short-term perspective, we need to see a break below this, from a medium-term perspective below this one, and vice versa from a short-term perspective for the bulls to take over above this area, and from a medium-term perspective. So let's see how it goes. We are still stuck inside the range, inside a big range which we saw from H4 and H1. Best of luck, and I'll update it tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here, and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 13. As mentioned yesterday, we are still struggling around the 18k, 20k support, so we don't really have much updates on lower time frames since yesterday. So for today, I'll focus on daily time frame. As we clearly see, this range here reminds me of the previous ones. The first one around 30k, and the previous one around 40k. And this range is very important because it shows us that the bulls aren't strong enough to reject it. So usually when you see a build-up, or where you see price stuck inside a range around the support area, chances are that we will have a break of the support downward. Vice versa in case of if we have a resistance zone. So is a live example previously. This was the previous high, and while waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above it and reject the 40k, we can see a very similar scenario now. This is our previous high, and here instead the bears took over by breaking below this lower bound of the range and below the 38k in this case, which is this bearish candle. For this range here, if you remember, like I posted many times about it, we were waiting for this break above this high, which didn't happen. Instead, we broke below it, and here we go. This bearish candle here, like, is the signal that the bears took over again, and we traded lower. So very similar scenario now. Let me draw the low bound the range, which is the 18k, which I keep on saying that if we have a momentum kind of close below it, the bears will take over and will keep moving forward. So let's monitor this, and chances are that we will see, just like previously, an overextended range. So we might see this before we break above both the trend line in brown and the upper range, or to see this, in this case, a movement to the 12k would be expected. That's it for Bitcoin, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here, and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 14. As usual, if you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still struggling inside this range, and we are waiting for the bulls to take over by breaking above the upper bound. In this case, a movement higher would be expected till around 30k and the upper blue trend line, or for the bears to take over by breaking below the lower bound, which would be 18k. In this case, a movement lower to the next demand zone around 10 to 12k would be expected. Meanwhile, if you zoom into lower time frame, as I showed you like 2 days ago, that we are currently trading inside this range, inside the range, and we have a head and shoulders pattern. For the bears to take over from a short-term perspective, we need to see a break below the neckline, which happened, and the bears kicked in. Of course, this is also from a medium-term perspective. So now we are currently sitting around the 20k. But to take over from a medium-term perspective, we need to see this break. Meanwhile, the bulls can still kick in here and trade higher. So for now, the bears are in control, and from a short-term perspective, medium-term perspective here, medium-term perspective for the bulls would be here, as I showed you 2 days ago, if you remember. That's it for Bitcoin. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 15. As usual, if you like the content, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are expecting a movement inside this range for a couple of days more before we eventually see a break above it or below it. We are expecting a break below it because of the previous cycle. So 1, 2, 1, 2 already done. We are waiting for the third one, right? A break downward before we finally got stuck inside a correction just like this one. But of course, we can't really say that the bears are taking over just yet before we see a break below it. For now, we are expecting a range. If you zoom into M30 time frame, as mentioned yesterday, the bears took over from a short-term perspective after breaking below this neckline, which I highlighted like 3 days ago, and now the bears took over from a medium-term perspective by breaking below this neckline or the 20k as well. So we are bearish, prices making low lows and lower highs, right? Trading below this trend line. Red for the bulls to take over, we'll be expecting this swing high and then a break above it. Meanwhile, we can still trade lower and lower, right? Like no matter if we break any highs, it would be a minor high. We want a break above this trend line to have a shift in momentum from bearish to bullish. The next rejection would be this demand zone, which is also the 18k, which has been rejected previously, of course, which is also the lower bound of this entire range. So we'll be expecting a bullish reversal from here. Of course, we'll be waiting for extra confirmation that the buyers are taking over by breaking above the previous high. Meanwhile, we'll be expecting this before eventually you break below or above. I hope you find that this useful as I'm updating it day after day. Let me know in the comments and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 16. As usual, if you like the content, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. It will help me move forward. So as we mentioned yesterday, we're expecting Bitcoin to be stuck inside this range for a while, so we'll be trading the range from a short-term perspective, looking for buy stops around the lower bound and sell setups around the upper bound until eventually the bulls take over from a long-term or medium-term perspective to start the correction to the 30k and the upper blue trend line, or for the bears to take over and then, which is more probable in my opinion, to trade lower before we trade higher to finish the previous cycle, which we also saw here 1, 2 and 3. We are currently inside the third phase inside the range, so we're expecting one more bearish movement like this before we start this flat correction just like here. But of course, we can't really know. We just follow our rules and wait for the bulls and bears to take over from a short-term perspective and long-term perspective. For now, we are trading inside the range, and since we are approaching the lower bound, we'll be looking for buy stops from short-term perspective. Unless the bears take over by breaking below with a massive daily candle close, then they will take over to trade lower. Now, if you zoom into M30 time frame, as I showed you yesterday, we broke below this area here, the 20k. So the bears also took over from a medium term perspective. We rejected this demand zone and we traded higher, made a correction to the previous neckline here and we traded lower. So, but the bulls didn't take over yet because, as mentioned, we are waiting for a break above the trend line and we simply have had an aggressive movement upwards in a wick and then a rejection from it. So this scenario is still probable, especially that we are approaching the 18k, which is acting as a lower bound of the range, the support area, and so on. So I'm still waiting for the bulls to take over. If and only if this happens, we break above the previous major high, which is about to be formed, and above the trend line, which is engulfing the overall movement downward. Of course, we also got like a falling, broadening wedge. Meanwhile, we are bearish. We can still trade lower and lower before we trade higher by breaking above the high or even break below it from daily time frame, as I showed you. That is for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 17. As mentioned yesterday, we are still trading inside this range and we are expecting a couple of days more inside it because if you compare this cycle to this one, we are currently halfway through. And since we are approaching the low bound of the range, we'll be trading the range. We'll be looking for buy stops from lower time frames as a short-term bullish movement. Of course, meanwhile, the bears are still in control, and if we have this big bearish daily candle close below it, then a movement lower would be expected. But for now, let's take it step by step inside the range, approaching the lower bound. So if we zoom into lower time frames to M30, we previously know that the bears took over from a short-term perspective here, long-term perspective or like medium-term perspective here, and now we are still waiting for the bulls to take over by forming a new swing high and then a break above it. For example, this would be it, or you can simply extend this one, and for extra confirmation, let's wait for the break above the 20k. So for example, we can still trade lower and lower. In this case, we'll be updating our trigger swing for it to be here, for example. And meanwhile, until this happens and the buyers take over, the bears can still kick in and break below this area. That's why you see my alert here, because I want to get notified when the bears are breaking below this zone. That's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 18. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we are expecting a couple of days more inside it, because if you compare this range to the previous one, we are still halfway through. Until eventually, of course, the buyers take over by breaking above the upper brown trend line and the upper range, or below the lower range, or the 18k with a big daily candle close below it. In this case, a movement low would be expected. But for now, we are still inside it, so let's take it step by step. And as price is approaching the lower bound, we zoom into lower time frames and look for buy setups. As mentioned yesterday, we are trading below this trend line. Of course, it's an entire zone, so we should make it like this or this. Okay, it doesn't really matter, and we wanted a break above it and above the 20k. So we don't really have a break above the 20k just yet. By break, I mean a full candle close above it, preferably from higher time frames like H4. Then and only then the bulls will take over, and then we'll be expecting this bullish movement. Meanwhile, the 20k is definitely acting as a resistance area and can still push this one lower. In this case, as we approach this lower area, we'll be looking for buy setups here. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 19. As usual, if you like the series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we are expecting a couple of days more inside it, because if you compare the previous range, we've got like 31, 32 candles or bars, and for now we've got only around 23 bars, so we're expecting a couple of days more, like 7 to 10 days more inside it, before we eventually have the break upward or downward. Of course, the breakdown is more probable because, as mentioned previously, we are currently sitting inside a build-up just like previously. Price approached a support, and instead of rejecting it, we are stuck inside the range, which is called a build-up, because we don't really have buying pressure. That's why chances are that the bears will take over. But of course, we can't really know until it happens. So for the confirmation, we would need a big daily bearish candle breaking below the range, which is also the 18k. In this case, we'll be expecting a bearish movement. For now, we'll be trading the range, and since we are approaching the lower bound, we'll be expecting a short-term bullish movement, because we are still expecting like a couple of more days inside it. If you zoom into M30 time frame, as I showed you yesterday, we broke above this high and the trend line, the 20k, but we didn't break above this area. Instead, price rejected this area, broke below the previous low, and we are currently trading lower. So this is a confirmation that the correction started from a short-term perspective, because we are clearly bullish from a short-term perspective. An impulse, correction, impulse, and we are currently in this correction phase. We can even see it better from H1. The bears took over here, and we had a massive movement upward then range, and we are currently bullish, a higher high and a higher low. So I'm expecting, as price approaches this area again, we will be looking for buy stops, of course, just like previously, just like this one. Of course, the more it approaches, sorry, the lower area, the better the setup like would be. Of course, I still have my alert here in case we got a break below this zone. So long story short, as price approaches this area, we'll be looking for buy setups. Of course, I'll be updating it tomorrow, hopefully, to see how it goes. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 20. As usual, if you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we are expecting a couple of days more inside it, like 7 to 10 days, because we compared yesterday this one to this one, and we still need like a couple of more candles, right? Until eventually we break it upward or downward, where the lower or the breakout downward is more probable, because we are currently inside a build-up just like previously. However, we can't really know. Trading is reactive and not predictive, so don't try to catch the exact bottom. Always wait for the bulls to take over before you buy, and vice versa before you sell, in case you are a margin trader. So for now, we are trading the range, and as price approaches the lower area, we are looking for short-term buy setups, and of course, vice versa. As price approaches the upper bound trend line and upper area, we'll be looking for sell setups. If you zoom into M30 time frame, we saw yesterday that we are currently overall bullish, trading inside this like rising broadening wedge, impulse correction, and the bigger the impulse, the bigger the correction. That's the nature of a rising broadening wedge, and we are currently inside this correction, waiting for the bulls to take over again because we are currently bullish from a short-term perspective. For the bears to take over to test the lower bound again, we need to see a break below the previous swing low, a major one, and also below the trend line and blue. Meanwhile, we would be bullish and will be trading higher and higher. And on every correction, you can look for a short-term buy setup. Of course, as we approach the upper bound, we will be looking for a reversal setup, unless or the bulls take over by breaking above it. That's it for today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 21. As usual, if you like the series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. So let's do it. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we're expecting a couple of days more inside it before we eventually see a breakout to the upside for the boost to take over and push it to around 30k and the upper brood channel, or the downside, which is more probable, in this case a movement lower than the 10-12k demand zone and lower brown trend line and blue zone, or like blue channel. So anyway, meanwhile, until the break happens, we are trading the range, and as price approaches the upper bound here, which would be the non-horizontal resistance in brown, and the upper area, we'll be expecting a drop lower, and of course if price retests this lower bound, we'll be looking for buy setups. If you zoom into H1 time frame, we can see that Bitcoin is now choppy, trading inside this big range. Inside it, we can see a big symmetrical triangle. Inside the symmetrical triangle, we can see a rising broadening wedge. So this is how you can feel the market from a short-term perspective. Meanwhile, you are bullish, prices making higher lows and higher highs, and as long as we are trading inside this range, we would be bullish from a short-term perspective until we approach this upper area. Of course, we can still reject this zone and trade lower, but you've got the idea, right? So it's getting narrower and narrower, which what would like to see, and which usually happens before we see a massive breakout, right? So a big range getting narrower before we finally see a breakout. Of course, a breakout above this symmetrical triangle, as we can see in green, might result in a fake out. Maybe we break it upwards, but we still need to see this break above the horizontal range for the bulls to take over, and vice versa. If you break it downward, we might find support around this area. So this is just from a short-term perspective as an early alert who might take over, but it wouldn't be final. Long story short, we are bullish now. As we approach this area, we'll be looking for a sell until it's broken upward, or unless it's broken upward. Of course, if we trade lower, we'll be looking for buy here and buy here unless it's broken downward. That's it for today. I'll update it tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 22. As usual, if you like the series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we are expecting a couple of days more inside it before we eventually have the breakout downward or upward. And yesterday we were around the lower band, so we're expecting the boost to take over, especially our confirmation was after breaking above this high here and above the 20k. So starting from here, we are now trading inside this rising broadening wedge, and we're expecting the boost to take over here and to remain in control, unless of course the bears take over by breaking below this rising broadening wedge. Anyway, we kept trading high and we are currently approaching the upper band. Since we broke above the symmetrical triangle, let's delete it and follow the price action. So let's engulf it with this channel, right? So now we are trading inside this channel. We can see it even better from H4 time frame. Let me show it to you in a cleaner manner. Here we go. So now we're approaching the upper band, which is obviously the upper brown trend line, upper zone in red, and this trend line here, which is considered an overbought area. So as we approach the upper band, just like previously, we were looking for a buy. Here we'll be speculating that the bears will take over. Of course, we need extra confirmation, for example, like a swing low to fall and then a break downward. That's when we zoom into lower time frames to M30 or even H1. So for now, the swing low is forming, and we can expect one more dive inside the zone before finally the bears take over by breaking below a low. For now, this is our last swing low, which is forming now. Of course, if we trade higher, we might even form a new swing low like this, for example, before we break it downward and trade lower. So we are still trading inside the range. We'll be trading it upward and downward until eventually you break it upward with a big momentum candle from daily time frame. In this case, the boost will take over. So we might still see this, but of course, we need to wait for it. Trading is reactive and not projective. Meanwhile, until we have the break, we'll be looking for this bearish movement with extra confirmation when the bears take over. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 23. As usual, if you like this series, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. So let's do it. As mentioned yesterday, we are stuck inside this range and previously we were around the lower band and we were looking for bottom tops. Now vice versa, since we are approaching the upper band, we'll be looking for sell setups on lower time frames. Of course, this would be from a short-term perspective because we are around the upper red zone and the upper brown trend line acting as a non-horizontal resistance. So now we're expecting this bearish movement to the lower bound, of course, for a couple more movements here before we eventually break it upward or downward. But for now, let's take it step by step, right? Around the upper bound, let's zoom into lower time frames to confirm that the bears are finally taking over. If you zoom into H1 time frame, I showed you that from a short-term perspective, we are trading inside this rising broadening wedge. We were looking for buy setups here, and now we are approaching the upper one, which is an overbought area, also intersection of the upper green one and the upper brown one. That's why we're expecting this movement. Of course, we can still trade a little bit higher, dive inside it before we trade lower, so we can't really know where the bears will take over. That's why from N30 time frame, this would be our confirmation. Just like previously, the bears took over here by breaking this head and shoulders, then the bulls took over here by breaking above this range, and now we are forming this range in the shape of a 1, 2, 3 pattern. This is what we were waiting for yesterday. For now, we formed this previous swing low, so for the bears to take over, we need to see a break below it. Of course, a big daily, like a big H1 candle close below it. In this case, a movement lower would be expected that the bears are taking over. Of course, next, this would be our lower bound, this lower trend line, the 20k, and also this lower like lower trend line in green. So we're still trading inside this range, looking for sell, looking for buy until eventually you break it upward, of course, unless we break it upward in a big daily candle close above this upper area, then the boost will take over and I'll be updating it tomorrow. So best of luck, have an amazing weekend, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hello traders, Rich here and welcome to Bitcoin in a Minute, day 25. As usual, if you like the content, let me know in the comments or simply leave a like. So let's do it. As mentioned yesterday, we are still stuck inside this range and we were looking for sell setups or expecting a bearish movement from here because Bitcoin was sitting around the upper brown trend line acting as a non-horizontal resistance and obviously the upper bound of this range. If you zoom into lower time frames, this was our confirmation. If you remember, I mentioned it 2 days ago and yesterday also as a picture analysis, as I couldn't do a video unfortunately. I'm sorry about that, but today here we go, we have a video update. So the bears took over by breaking below this candle and we are currently overall bearish from a short-term perspective. And if you remember, we've marked this area as it's a very strong resistance zone, as it's the intersection of the upper blue trend line, upper green trend line of this channel, and of course the upper brown trend line, so which is what I call a trio retest. So trend line, and trend line. Anyway, with the bears took over, and now since we broke below this at the trend line, let's read this rising broadening wedge, and we are currently trading inside this channel in green. You can see it better from H1 time frame, our impulse, correction, impulse, and we are currently in this correction phase. So now, as mentioned yesterday, as in the picture analysis, that this is an interesting area to look for, as it would be the intersection of the lower orange trend line of this bearish trend now and the 20k. Of course, it would also be intersection with the lower green trend line. So let me, if you want updated, here we go in a cleaner manner. Just like the upper area, we have a trio retest, multiple rejections. That's why we're speculating a bearish movement. Vice versa, here we've got multiple rejections, lower trend line, 20k, and this lower trend line in green from a longer term perspective. Of course, If broken downward, then a movement to the lower main horizontal range would be expected, where we'll be also looking for buy setups. Of course, this is just from a short-term perspective. We are trading the range. Eventually, for the bears or bulls to take over from a long-term perspective, we need to see this break or this break. But for now, while trading the range, if you remember previously, we were looking for buy setups here. Now we looked for a sell setup and vice versa. Now we are approaching a support area. This is a minor one, so we're expecting a bullish reversal. Of course, for the bulls to take over, we need to see a break above this channel upward, and like this would be from a short-term perspective. For example, if we trade lower, 4-minute swing low, and we break it upward, we'll be expecting a movement higher, but we've got this trend line also that we need a break above. So long story short, this is a support area that will monitor price action here to monitor if we will get a high and a break above it. Best of luck, and I'll see you tomorrow.